not working time to join us today. So thanks for that. We're joined today by Queen's University Belfast and Anya and Peter, who I'll let introduce themselves in a minute. But we will, hand over to them. Anya will give a bit of a background on Queens, and then Peter will be giving us a bit of a mini lecture. And if you do have any questions, please do feel free to pop them in the chat at any point. We're hoping today will be quite interactive, so we'd love to hear from you. And just to let you know that we're recording the session for our colleagues that cannot join live. So thanks again for joining, and I hand over to Anya now.
Thank you, Hayley. It's brilliant to be here, and I'll just echo the thanks for the enthusiasm of coming along to today's session, especially if some of you are at the beach or the lake. I'm very impressed by that in particular. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to speak with the NAFA community. We've been working with NAFA for a number of years now, and we're delighted to host your conference, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So brilliant that we can now do this online, and it's super that I'm joined today by Dr. Peter McLaughlin, who's going to be doing a little bit of a flash seminar for you. Before we dive into Peter's seminar, I was just going to give a super brief overview of Queen's. I'm conscious that not everybody will have had the opportunity to engage with us in the past or to visit the campus. So I'm going to limit myself to about 3 minutes just to give you a quick overview of the institution. So let me just pop some slides up on the screen here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see those. So to give you a little bit of background on Queen's as an institution, we're located in Belfast City, so that's in Northern Ireland. We are geographically located on the island of Ireland, and of course lots of our local culture is very much influenced by that, but politically and economically we are part of the UK, which makes us a very interesting destination for students in terms of the cultural mix they receive whenever they come to us from the USA, but also the sorts of conversations and tuition that they can engage with at the university. And I know that Peter's going to say a little bit more about that context in his talk. The university is the 9th oldest in the UK, founded in 1845, although interestingly, the university was actually founded before Northern Ireland existed. So we were founded as one of 3 Queen's colleges on the island of Ireland originally. Today we're ranked in the top 200 globally, and we're a member of something called the Russell Group that you might be familiar with, which is essentially a group of 24 research-intensive universities across the UK. We started with about 200 students whenever the university was first founded. Today we have about 25,000 students from over 90 countries worldwide, and about 300 of those students would come from the USA. And that's at a mixture of different career levels. So we welcome students from the US at undergrad level, at graduate level, and of course, PhD programs as well. What's lovely for us is that quite a high number of our graduate students do come to us on fellowship programs, either those that are nationally competitive programs like Marshall, but also scholarships that Queen's University itself has created. So you can see a couple of the photographs there are from recent scholarship gatherings, and of course our Hillary Rodham Clinton Scholar meeting the Chancellor herself a couple of years ago. So we do have very strong links to the United States. Of course, our fellowships are part of that, but the relationship is much, much broader. Our current Chancellor is Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. So she has been Chancellor of the institution since 2020. And essentially that is a ceremonial role. So Secretary Clinton would help us with things like our graduation ceremonies, but also really important flagship events on campus. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a second. But to give you a flavour of some of the other US links at the campus, we also have the Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. This is a really interesting interdisciplinary hub on the campus that was founded in 2016. and it's looking at areas of major societal change. So lots of different departments at Queen's feeding into that institute. And again, lots of interesting events happening there as well. So I will share a couple of the upcoming online events in the chat shortly, and you can have a look at those. We also have a William Clinton Leadership Institute that was founded in 2011. This is based at Queen's Management School. So again, for any students who are thinking about graduate programs in the area of business or management, this might be a centre that's of interest to them. They're leading on lots of really cutting edge work around engagement in the community and thinking about different approaches and models of leadership that can be implemented within a more business context. So final slide and final comments from me before I hand over to the real star of the show, that is Peter. We are celebrating a very significant anniversary in Northern Ireland this year. That's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Peace Agreement. There is going to be a major event happening on the Queen's campus later on this month to mark that, so 17th to the 19th of April. We will be bringing together a lot of the original team who were involved in that agreement negotiation, some of the key political figures who were around at that time. And importantly, we'll be streaming quite a chunk of that online. So if that's something that you or your students might be interested in, we would love to have you join some of that conference online. I will pop the link to that into the chat as well. And the live stream will push out through that page on the day. So I'm going to pause there and hand over to Peter McLaughlin to introduce himself and his talk. Thank you, Peter.
Great, thanks very much, Anya. Now I'm going to try and put my slides up here. It's a little while since I've done this, so just bear with me a second. Since I've had to teach online or do a lecture online, so let's see if that comes up. Okay, hopefully there should be, my slides should be up there, the title out in Northern Ireland, so maybe someone could send me a message if there's any issue there, because I'm asking, yeah, great, thanks Anya for confirming, because there's been some little glitch with my my Teams today. I couldn't actually see Anya's slides there, so as long as you can see mine, that's the most important thing. Okay, folks, lovely to speak to you. So just echoing what Anya said, and I see there's quite a range from different parts of the state, so I'm guessing very different times, and so as well as giving up your holidays, the fact that you might be unusual times there, it's really great to speak to you. Anya's given me quite a tricky task here as well. She wanted to talk about, obviously, very notable anniversary she was referring to there, 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, which she mentioned the Mitchell Institute, named after your Senator George Mitchell, who was the chair of the talks there. You can see him in the image there with Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, the British and Irish premiers. So recognised for his really important role in chairing those talks. So 25 years on from that, I believe he's going to be visiting in a couple of weeks' time. But also to try and give you a bit of a flavour for that, what the problem was here, which is not easy to do because it's quite a complex historical conflict that's gone on for many hundreds of years before there was a Northern Ireland, and I'm not going to be able to get into all of that. And so what I'm really going to just do, I'm not going to use too many words. Actually, let me get on to my next slide. This is the main slide where I have a few words just to give you an overview of what's known as the Troubles, euphemistically, because it was a very serious conflict that happened here from the late 1960s till 1998, when the Good Friday Agreement effectively brought that conflict to an end. It doesn't mean it's completely resolved, and I'll come back to that point. But just to give you a flavour of that, it was, you know, a very serious conflict here. Now, it's a small society. It's less than 2 million people here. So 3,500 people. There's obviously much bigger conflicts in the world, but when you scale that up, and I've done that with US figures there for you, you get a sense of you're up near kind of your Civil War losses there, really over 500,000. So it gives you a sense of, for a very small society, this conflict really touched pretty much every family in some way, whether they lost a loved one or someone was injured or wrongfully imprisoned or such like. So quite a serious conflict that went on, and therefore quite a significant achievement with the US's help. And that's one of the things I teach about, that the Clinton administration, George Mitchell, were very, very important in trying to get the end of the conflict. So another few key facts here to give you a sense of the scale of this is it was the longest engagement in British military history. And of course, as Americans, you'll also know, the amount of very important conflicts that, America and Britain have fought alongside each other. But this, in the UK's own backyard, as it were, was the longest single military operation. When the troops came in 1969, they thought they'd be here for a few months, and they were here for many decades after that. A very serious, a number of different paramilitaries. The most significant was the IRA, so a pro-nationalist Republican paramilitary, which was a pretty effective organization, whatever your views of it. And on 2 occasions, it nearly killed the Prime Minister. So one time, a bomb put under Margaret Thatcher's hotel room came very close to killing her. On another occasion, rockets were actually fired into 10 Downing Street in London. So this shows that these, whatever people's opinions of this organization, that it was, they weren't dopey, they weren't stupid, they were pretty shrewd outfit, and very difficult for the intelligence agencies and the British security services to deal with. On the other hand of this, you also had very serious human rights violations by the British state. The most famous, that had a big impact in Irish America, was Bloody Sunday in January 1972, when civil rights protesters were shot by the army and all proven to be innocent. So this had a very destabilizing effect and a radicalizing effect even on moderate opinion. So very serious offences committed by the British state as well. And it also involved the Republic of Ireland, so the southern part of the island, that there were very, very serious bombings in Dublin and Monaghan and other areas as well. So you can see how this conflict spread right throughout. Northern Ireland was where it was really focused, but it was a problem for Britain and Ireland, and that's really the history of it. It's Northern Ireland is kind of a legacy of a broader problem of relationships between Britain and Ireland. So that's an overview of the Troubles. But even that is, well, first of all, hopefully what I'm getting across there is now we've got a peace process and a much more stable, normal, democratic society, but it's still a pretty amazing place to come and study, to teach. Indeed, for me to be able to teach history and politics, which is what I do, because I can just send students to just walk around the city I'm in, Belfast, and you can see there on the sides of houses, this is quite a regular thing, is that people paint, the very historical battles and commemorations, and, very different. Those 2 images, one is a very pro-unionist one, talking about William of Orange back in 1690. One is more modern, but still over 100 years ago, the Irish Rebellion of 1916, which was very important in creating an independent Ireland. So very different histories put on, painted on our walls and all over the place in Belfast. So it's a very historical and politicized city, and even that's affected, our arts. And for those of you, I'm guessing, might be familiar, I've heard that this has even had some impact. The Derry Girls TV show in the US, it certainly had a big impact in England, which people didn't think it would. So this a kind of sick comedy series about young girls growing up in the Troubles, which has been a huge export for Northern Ireland. So I think it's had some impact in there in the US. Hopefully, maybe some of you in the chat can say yes or no. Yes. So Lindsay's saying one of her favourite shows. Yeah. So we were quite surprised at the impact this had, but it shows you how out of conflict, as is often the case with art, or Seamus Heaney's poetry. There we have the Seamus Heaney Centre here. A lot of his poetry is shaped by the fact that he also is from here and has written about the kind of history and all this kind of that's been created. So the fact that it's a very politicized and engaged and literate, and people want to argue and debate a lot of these things, has been problematic. But it's also a gift for scholars, for those of us teaching, because we rarely get students who are not interested in reading or not interested in learning, and even if they're not orthodox learners. And great, I'm seeing a few more messages coming up. So yeah, I'm glad that I hadn't got that wrong. I thought the very brief time I lived in the US, I could see that this was having an impact, and so it seems like it's now lots of people are learning about this. So it's another great advertisement for what we do, that you can learn about politics even through our art and literature and everything, and whether it's law or whatever you do, that it's quite an interesting place to study here. Getting back to try and explain some of that, why we've got, because even those two pictures on the sides of the buildings, they're from conflicts that kind of took place before Northern Ireland came into being. So as Anya suggested, asked me to, I'm going to try and give you a bit of history to try and make sense of this place. I will be missing a lot of detail, but and I'm not going to use many words. I'm going to use more images to just try and get across the essence of this, but also the complexity, the multiple dimensions of this conflict, right? To try and make it make some sense, and but hopefully leave you with a lot of questions, and even more think that if you were sending students here, that they would have some great questions for us. First of all, a lot of people think about this conflict, Northern Ireland, and what brought Northern Ireland into being as being a religious conflict. And that's very understandable, because we even use those terms still today ourselves, Catholic and Protestant. Probably not technically accurate. It's better to say nationalists and unionists, but I'll explain why. But it's understandable that we still have to, even though it's a much more secular society now, that we can't explain this conflict without the plantation, the fact that in effect, as a way to control the smaller island of Ireland, Great Britain, a much more powerful, great power, planted Ireland with what it saw as loyal Protestants. Ireland was very Catholic and was likely to therefore ally with Catholic France, Catholic Spain. And so as a way of trying to control this little island, which was kind of if you think about it, like from a security point of view, for a naval power, that's a kind of a back door for invading Britain. So again, when I explain this to American audiences, I sometimes think about Cuba. Think about this little island for you that has been a security concern over the years, back in the Cold War and so on. Ireland is kind of similar historically for Britain, that it's always been a security issue from a British point of view. And the way to secure it, thought best, was to say, well, let's put some loyal English and Scots Protestants, because Catholics are going to always ally with France and Spain. So that explains why this part of the island, which was the most rebellious actually, and the most Irish, the most Catholic and the most Irish speaking, was very thoroughly planted with Protestants, and why we still have two communities today that are kind of defined religiously, historically, because there are, Catholic and Protestant, and why when the conflict broke out, people still saw it as being essentially a religious conflict, that it was a replaying of what had gone on. And I've got images there below that, were similar to what was going on throughout Europe in this period, medieval Europe, Catholic and Protestant Reformation, Counter-Reformation. Of course, it's why a lot of people went to the US and founded the US, right, is to get away from religious conflict. So when things started here again, because it was a restarting the historic conflict, when this happened, started again in the late 60s, when you had figures like Dr. Ian Paisley there, the black and white image, that's Ian Paisley when he was protesting in the European Parliament. He was a member of that. And when Pope John Paul visited, Paisley's very extreme religious views, that he viewed the Vatican as being the Antichrist and so on, that he was protesting about this and got thrown out of the European Parliament. And you can imagine, therefore, most of Europe thought this is an antiquated place that's still fighting religious wars that we've done with. Not to put it all on one side, that just the Protestant community is very hard line there. A lot of people would say it's the education system we still have here, and would blame more the Catholic side there for deciding to set up its own Catholic system, whereby still we have an overwhelmingly segregated, effectively, education system. Most of our students, local students, would have 95% would have gone to Catholic or effectively Protestant schools. So a lot of people feel that religion is still part of the social structure here. And that's why you can understand, particularly for outsiders, think this is a religious conflict. It's religious in its origins, and it's being played out again. You might not be fighting about such theological issues, but it's still essentially a religious divide. So that's understandable on one hand, but I want you to think about it another way as well. So again, I'm skipping a lot of detail here to just try and give you a feel for the complexity of this conflict, which also helps understand why it was so hard to resolve. Because you could say it's religious, but you could also say it's about nationality, right? That it's really about two different nations. Because if you look what the conflicting groups, the paramilitaries, the armed groups here were saying, and this is what they were painting on their walls as well as their historical battles, you can see there's an IRA, a Republican or nationalist mural that's saying, get the Brits out, and it's got a caricature of Margaret Thatcher. It's obviously from the 1980s. Thatcher representing Britain kind of chewing Ireland and keeping a hold of Ireland. So, you know, from a nationalist Republican point of view, the solution was to get rid of the British influence over Ireland, that if Ireland was free and united, there would be no conflict. But look at what the Unionists are saying. They're saying kind of the mirror image thing, get the Irish out. The conflict is about nationality. So this is clearly for them not really to do with religion and their kind of more modern images, but look at those posters from the 1900s where the flags were a bit different on the Irish side, on the nationalist side, but they're essentially the same thing. They're arguing for different nations, for an Irish independent nation, or to maintain under the Crown as part of Westminster rule, as part of the United Kingdom. So, you know, if you look what the actual groups themselves are saying, they're saying it's about nationality. It's about, we want an Irish flag or we want a British flag, that it's really about national identity, that religion is misleading. It might have been part of the history, but it's about nationality in the modern context. But let's make things a bit more complex still, right? That there's those who would argue, well, hang on, both of those are misleading. It's actually about class. It's about socioeconomic issues. If you look what started it, going back to the late 60s, again, an American link here, that it was partly inspired by the African American civil rights movement, that kind of using the tactics that had been used by Martin Luther King and others, the same kind of protests and sit-down rallies and so on. It was about the discrimination that the Catholic minority faced at that time in terms of particularly jobs, housing, voting, etc. So you could argue that they were being motivated by material grievances, the fact that they were on much higher unemployment, they didn't have the same kind of housing conditions, so that this was really a kind of a material class-based conflict. You can even see there in the middle a picture of John Lennon, of, you know, a figure who not only, in my opinion, being one of the greatest songwriters ever, but a kind of a figurehead for the peace movement. And yet look at the pamphlet he's holding there. He's holding a pro-IRA pamphlet. This is very early in the conflict, and seemingly you've got this guy who's revered as a peace leader being pro-IRA. Now that might reflect some of his own ethnic Irish heritage, but also because he was a leftist and he believed, he understood the conflict like a lot of people, a lot of young people, a lot of left-wing people in the 70s and 80s, as being, really, this is imperialism. This is the British capitalist state using flags and religion to divide the workers. You can see the pamphlet on the right there from a socialist activist as well, trying to say, why can't Catholic and Protestant unite? Because all of the left, all the socialists, despair of the idea that the workers, the poor people on both sides, are divided by religion and flags, and that if they got together, they would fight for a more just future. So back in the 70s, whether it wasn't just John Lennon, but probably most academics, because of course then, you know, during the Cold War, kind of Marxist economistic analysis of politics was far more in vogue, and the vast majority of writings on Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s will be saying religion, nationalism, these are just disguises for capitalism and imperialism, and it's a trick on the workers to get them to fight and divide, and therefore allow the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, to maintain their exploitation of Northern Ireland or Latin America or wherever it was. So you can see how those kind of Cold War analyses of Latin American, African and politics and so on also influenced Northern Ireland, and those who would say this is really material. It's material grievances, it's about class conflict, and the solution is uniting Catholic and Protestant workers to fight for a socialist or a social democratic system that would have equal rights for everybody. One final way of looking at it, before I try and tie this together a bit, is that some would see this as a conflict of two cultures and say, well, look, it's even beyond the material, it's the more inexplicable culture, because, you know, what is culture? It's kind of much everything that we do that's kind of artistic, or, you know, is kind of non-material. It doesn't necessarily make rational sense, but can make us feel good or entertain us. Because again, you've got images there on both sides of marches. Marching culture here is a real unusual phenomenon on both sides. That you have there, the orange marches, which are probably more popular on the Protestant side, like that there's more marches, but Republicans also, you can see on the right there, the kind of the paramilitary kind of garb. That's something which most people in the Republic of Ireland, who would say, well, we're Irish, obviously, they wouldn't understand. That's seen as very old history to them. Equally, the Orange men on the left, in most parts of England, most parts of Scotland, not all parts of Scotland, some would understand it, but for most people, this is, again, a throwback to the 1600s. They don't understand this. This is not British culture. This is not Irish culture. It's a Northern Ireland culture, some would argue, is that both sides just like to march and annoy each other. Some would argue cynically that it's about annoying each other. But certainly these things are just, they're unique to Northern Ireland. Even if you look at the kind of sporting images, you might think that's two different teams winning the same cup because it looks a pretty similar cup. That's actually two different games. That's rugby and Gaelic football. So the Gaelic football would be kind of like your American football version of soccer, right? Whereas rugby, you might be more familiar with, is a more of a British English game. And so I referred to our schools earlier. It's very common for our Protestant schools here to play rugby, for our Catholic schools to play Gaelic football or hurling, kind of Irish sports. So even when they play, even with sports can be divisive. Even when they follow the same game, I've got an image there at the bottom of Celtic Rangers. Some of you might have heard of this. So a very big soccer game in Glasgow, because a lot of Irish went to Glasgow as well during the famine, like a lot of Irish went to America in the famine. So you have this kind of sectarian rivalry in Glasgow. So even when these two football teams that are not in Northern Ireland play, loads of people from Northern Ireland go over every week to see these games, to see Catholic, what they see as Catholic Celtic or Protestant Rangers fighting, what they want them to have, fight for the title. So it's a sporting game, but it becomes intensified by sectarian sentiment. So even when they follow the same sport, it becomes divided on kind of green and orange or red, white and blue and green kind of lines. I've got an image there of a protest over the Irish language as well. So I could list off many, many things here that can be very divisive. Attitudes towards the Irish language here. Most Catholics would be supportive, and increasingly a number of Protestants are starting to learn it. But for a lot of Unionists, a lot of Protestant people, they see the Irish language as a threat, whereas for Irish Catholics, they see it as just restoring a language which was badly damaged by British colonisation from their point of view. So these are all kind of cultural issues that they're not political, and yet you can see there's a political dynamic to them. But they're about things which in other contexts wouldn't be political, sports and language, and yet they're politicized here. So some would argue that this is really a cultural conflict, that it's a culture of conflict, and that people will find anything to argue about, whether it's football or whether it's language, and that's really what's at stake here. Now, what I would argue is it's all of those things. It's every one of those things. And the reason now I've got this final image coming up trying to explain what this conflict is about or has been about is it's all of those things mixing together, and that's what makes it so powerful. And that's why I'm comparing it to the Middle East here, and I'm putting those images of flags at the center, because that's what it all, the lightning rod, that's what it all centers on, and that's what it is really about, is about, do you want to be Irish or British? Are you Israeli or Palestinian? But we can't take away the religion, same in the Middle East, that flows into this. The fact that you've got these historic settlement patterns, whether it was a Protestant plantation here or so many Jewish people coming to Palestine during the 30s and 40s and 50s, without reference to history. So obviously how powerfully important something like the Holocaust is for people's sense of Jewish identity and the Israeli sense of security, or how on the other side here in Northern Ireland, how battles that were fought in the 1600s mean something to somebody because it was when they were victorious, or that they secured their position. So all of that kind of history and culture and the material factors come into it. Yes, that civil rights and the inequality and the very gross inequality there was here in the 60s definitely fueled the conflict. Just as on the right there, you can see the picture of, Palestinian poverty undeniably feeds into the extremism you see in places like the West Bank and Gaza. And there's extremism obviously on both sides, but certainly we can say that the poverty that you see more in places like Gaza particularly is bound to fuel people who feel desperate enough to blow themselves up and to commit these acts which are incomprehensible to us. But what it all comes down to, you could say that's religion and fanatical religion, or it's, material desperation. But that it really centers on this idea of we want a Palestinian state, or we want to protect Israel, or we want to keep Northern Ireland British, or create a united Ireland. So that is at the heart of it, and what I call it an ethno-national conflict, because it's informed by ethnicity, which is your history, your culture, your language, all of the things I've talked about. But it really centres on being about nationalism and trying to achieve a different national outcome, a different constitution. So the term we tend to use is ethno-national, that both Northern Ireland and the Middle East are both ethno-national conflicts. And that's kind of what we teach at Queen's. Northern Ireland's obviously a huge part of what we teach, but we try to get even our local students to kind of understand how it's comparable with the Middle East, or to look at other conflicts in Latin America and Africa and Asia that might have similar dimensions where these things come into play. So it's a very complex conflict, but thankfully was resolved, not least with a bit of help from you guys. And again, so I've got my image there of Senator Mitchell, who negotiated this deal. So very briefly in the time I've got left, because I want to try and leave some time for questions. So Senator Mitchell was very important in negotiating this deal along with the British and Irish governments. And this is what it essentially does. And again, I'm having to simplify here, but to try and explain how we resolve this very complex conflict. Well, the key things that the agreement did is, first of all, it created a power sharing government. So nationalist and unionist, Catholic and Protestant, are both represented in the government. Nobody is excluded, and there's checks and balances and vetoes for everybody. Parity of esteem is the phrase that was used again and again in the agreement. It basically means equality of identity. So you have an unusual situation under the agreement here where you can be both British or Irish. You can hold either passport. If you're born in Northern Ireland, you can have both passports if you want, which I think is a very sensible thing to do. So it just tries to respect the fact that you're Irish, or you're British, or you're a bit of both. You might be from a mixed background, then that's fine. It tries to accept diversity. It guarantees socioeconomic equality and counters discrimination. So there was a lot of problems with kind of housing, and even more so employment discrimination, continuing right into the 1990s. And the Good Friday Agreement continued the process of outlawing any practices that did that, and made sure that everybody was treated equally. There were very controversial aspects for victims of the violence when prisoners were released, so paramilitary prisoners, and probably none more so than the gentleman there coming out of prison. This was actually the guy, and I've actually forgotten his name. He would be known colloquially as the Brighton bomber. So I mentioned at the outset the attempt to kill Margaret Thatcher and the bomb that was planted under her hotel room. That's the guy who did it. So even, you think of the equivalent of people who've tried to assassinate Reagan in the early 80s or something, the idea that you would let someone out for doing that. Well, someone who tried to kill the head of the British government as part of the deal, even the British government had to accept this. So it was very painful for people who'd been injured or lost loved ones in the conflict. But this was seen as necessary to have a peace deal, that there was effectively an amnesty of sorts. Lawyers don't call it an amnesty, but there was in a sense. That there was demilitarization. The army would eventually withdraw and be taken off the streets. There was radical policing reform to make sure policing was done properly. And there was decommissioning, that the various paramilitaries had to give up their weapons, which people didn't think they would see. The IRA had a huge arsenal of weapons, and eventually it gave all its weapons up. It took a few years after the Good Friday Agreement, but that was part of the deal as well. So it would seem a very successful deal, but I'm going to end by just saying not quite. There's still problems here. That what the agreement cleverly did is it didn't really resolve the constitutional question, which is the key question here of whether it should be British, Irish, United Ireland, or stay under the United Kingdom. Is it kind of left it up to future generations, and Brexit has kind of reanimated that now, because people are feeling that Brexit is pushing Northern Ireland towards a united Ireland, and so unionists are very upset about that. Nationalists are very excited and want a referendum. So it's become very polarizing again. For a long time that was dormant, and we could just get on with power sharing, and that right now power sharing isn't working. Related to that key issue, we still argue an awful lot about flags, about identity. If you like, I showed you some of those images at the outset. People still paint their curbstones and put pictures on the wall, and still argue about history and interpretations of history. All of these things, what might be known as culture wars in the US or other parts of the world, we've had culture wars for a long time here, and they continue. Even that system of nationalist, unionist power sharing, okay, it seems sensible. You put everybody in government, but as has happened right now, when they disagree about something like Brexit, it means they can veto each other and the government doesn't work. And a lot of people feel that by making it nationalist and unionist, that you encourage people to think nationalist, unionist, British, Irish, reproduce those politics rather than voting for a socialist or a feminist or an environmental party. So, some people feel that it kind of institutionalizes the division, that it accommodates it if you're positive, or if you're more cynical, that you say it kind of reproduces the dynamics of conflict. And we're still very segregated here. I mentioned earlier about the education system, and you can see the kind of images there of the very big peace walls we still have in parts of North Belfast and so on, that separate some working class communities, and that people don't want those walls taken down. And so therefore they only really, their kids play on one side of the wall and don't meet each other, and therefore don't have relationships, don't intermarry as much. So we still have quite a high segregation in terms of intermarriage, very high endogamy, meaning marriage within your own community. So we still have quite a divided society here. It's much reconciled, it's essentially peaceful, but it is still a divided society, and in some ways it looks normal, but it's much more like some post-colonial societies in Africa or Asia, because it's still got those fundamental divide lines within its society. I'm going to stop there, and as ever, I'm kind of conscious I've galloped through an awful lot of history. I've hopefully not made it too confusing. It is confusing, and hopefully what I've done is showed you why it's very, very complex. And hopefully you might have some questions that might help make more sense if I've lost you, but I will pause there and see how it goes. And thank you, Brenda, for your positive comment. And yes, if anyone's got any questions in the chat, or maybe even now, you can use your mics if I need to clarify, or I didn't want to go on too long, so I kind of galloped through a bit there, and hopefully there's a bit of time for questions. Maybe not, maybe I've lost you all completely. I hope not. But it's just to give you a kind of a sense of a flavour. Maybe that's enough for what you need here, but by all means, if you want to type a question in, I'll keep my eye on it. But that's hopefully giving you a sense of the kind of thing that particularly I teach history and politics, but you can see how if you were teaching literature like Seamus Heaney, or if you were teaching drama, you would, there's things like Derry Girls and so on, or if you were teaching law, that you can see how issues of policing and policing parades, all of these kind of things are problematized by our very politicized society, and how history and politics and religion still interweave with all of what's going on here. But yeah, if there's any questions, please do feel welcome either to use the mic or to use. So Anya's asking, so how you engage with the local context in a practical way for the many graduate programs in your school. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much, Anya. So we have a whole series of MA programs here where, as you can imagine, they focus on peace and conflict and peace building and conflict resolution. And hopefully I've given a bit of a sense how we constantly, Northern Ireland's a wonderful laboratory, right? Because as I've said, I can kind of, we have so many things on our doorstep, a very political city, but we also, with our MA programs, a number of them are linked to the kind of local institutions we have here. So we have a local government, we have Stormont when it's working, our local assembly. We have a local BBC. Okay, so it's headquartered in London, but we've got a local BBC. It's a regional capital. So we've got all of these great places we can send out students to do internships, to work with media, see what it's like about reporting journalism in a conflict situation, or that you can look at the education system here, or look at how policing is reformed. So there's lots of ways in which our MA programs have a practical experiential element, where we have various kind of speakers come in to who might be representing the police or local government or border security, or that we have kind of engagements where we take students to Stormont, to our local parliament, or we take them to the various kind of political institutions that are here, to understand these things more and how politics works and how the peace process is working. There's various grassroots conflict resolution groups here. So I talked about the prisoners coming out of after the conflict. A lot of those are involved in grassroots kind of reconciliation activities, and are very useful for our students to work with in terms of learning how actual combatants, those who were involved in the violence, have engaged in a very different path now and have been very, very important. There's an awful lot that students can learn, not just from me, reading an awful lot of books about Northern Ireland history, but people who are actually involved in the conflict and who have a very different perspective, and who might have not had the privilege, as lucky as I was, to be able to spend most of my time at school and university, but were from working class communities where they had a very different sense of why they did what they did. So there's lots of ways in which we have quite a small city here, but it's a really wonderful place where we can engage with local communities and institutions and the police force and lots of other ways to say this is like I say, a laboratory to try and understand conflict and peace building. And there's lots of different ways which, compared to even bigger cities in the United Kingdom or Ireland, like Manchester or Dublin, for such a small place, we've got if you're studying conflict, history, peace building, we're really blessed in what we've got here, I feel. Hopefully that's kind of answered it. And I know Anya's put up some links for you there, the various postgrad taught courses. So we teach conflict resolution, we teach global borders, we teach more standard courses like international relations, but obviously that gives you a perspective on how Britain and Ireland interact, and Brexit has been a real challenge here, and how that's going to change our economy. So Brexit has been a boon for us, as problematic as it is, to try and understand how we work through differences in terms of how political decisions affect different people. But again, I'll stop there because I've maybe talked too much and see if there's any other questions coming in. And Anya, feel free to chip in yourself as well if you feel I'm missing things here. Okay, so question here. Will appeal to, what is the housing situation around Queen's? I could say a little bit about that, and Anya, you might know a bit as well, is that I'm not an expert on it, so because I'm an academic, but I'm pretty sure that any Anya, you can correct me on this now, but I'm pretty sure anyone who is coming from outside of the UK is prioritised, and we've even built an awful lot more now in the city centre recently, that there is a pretty healthy kind of abundance of student housing. I'm sure that there could be more, but normally international students, if I'm not mistaken, Anya, are prioritised, so that you certainly, if you're here for a year or if you're here for a few years in your first year, you will be guaranteed Queen's accommodation, if that's what you want. That is university owned and administered accommodation that also makes sure that you're in kind of blocks with probably similar, an international background, or that you get to meet local people, that you're in kind of a group which would help you socially as well as integrate with your studies. So that's my essential overview of how housing works, and hopefully it's answering the question that it's not normally a problem in terms of housing here. And of course, there's lots of private sector housing as well. So I don't believe housing is quite such a problem. I mean, there's always demand. Any campus town is going to have those demands, but I think we prioritise international students. And Anne, you might correct me if I've got anything wrong there in what I said.
No, that's all right, Peter. You're totally correct. So we guarantee housing for any international student coming into the university as long as they apply before a certain deadline in the summer. And to be honest, most of our Americans tend to apply months and months before that. So we don't have any challenge there. The university has significantly expanded its housing stock in the last number of years. But there's equally, quite a dynamic private housing sector as well. So lots of our students would choose to spend their first year in the university accommodation, and then they might decide to rent for the rest of their undergraduate or PhD program, or indeed if they're staying on after their masters. I'm sure some of our NAFA colleagues will be aware that any student who graduates from a UK institution is entitled to 2 years on the graduate route visa after they finish their program. So we're increasingly seeing lots of students who want to stay and enjoy a couple more years in Belfast, either to work or to continue studying. So yeah, that's been a really, really positive picture. And it's been fascinating really over the last 10 years or so to just see how much the university and the diversity of the university population has changed the landscape of South Belfast. So it's a much, much more international place than it ever was before. And we're really pleased to see that diversity around too.
The one thing I might add to that as well is we are quite a small city, and so the university is in South Belfast, and most students would live within walking distance. Most staff do as well. I mean, Belfast itself, you can pretty much walk most places in Belfast, or certainly cycle like I do. But most students would walk. There's there's very limited need. Even you can walk into the city centre from Queens, and most students would just get out of bed and walk into their lectures, within about 20 minutes tops, but a lot of them might be 5 or 10 minutes away. So depending on where you are, but South Belfast is where most students live, and I think we're quite lucky in that regard as well. It's quite compact, and therefore a lot of the social life as well goes on around South Belfast, a lot of the bars and restaurants and so on. The city centre has also come on a lot more recently post peace process, but you actually still have a lot of the nightlife focused around Queens.
Yeah, that's true. I think people often think of Belfast being a post-conflict space that maybe might not have a lot of the arts, the culture, the music, the food scene that some other cities might across the UK and Ireland, but that has really dramatically changed in the last 20 years or so as well. So I now like to think we're the hidden gem across the islands, and a really good destination for students who do want that more I guess community feel in the city that they come to, somewhere that they can begin to feel at home in quickly, build networks in quickly. One of the big benefits of being in a smaller town is that it's very easy for us to plug our students into community groups, into clubs, societies, to meet with other academics or people who are outside of academia that they might want to engage with for the purpose of their studies or for work experience. So I think that kind of compact size of the city is really supportive in that way. So I'm conscious of people's time. I think we've got 9 minutes left before we're due to switch off. And I wanted to just briefly share a couple of slides about scholarships. I know that you'll be advising students on different scholarship opportunities over the coming months, and certainly be working towards some of the nationally competitive deadlines. So we normally try and do a webinar for NAFA at least once a year. I'm going to give you a very, very abbreviated version of that now, which is just to say we have over 10 scholarships available to students from the USA who are interested in coming to Queen's. To give you a sense of what that looks like, we support a Fulbright Award in Global Security and Borders. We obviously support the Marshall Scholarship Programme as well, the Mitchell Scholarship Programme, and then we have a whole series of Queen's-owned scholarships or fellowship programs as well. They vary in terms of which program or discipline they're oriented to, or what the particular criteria might be linked to one of these awards. So I will drop a link to the scholarships page into the chat, and you can have a look at that afterwards. But importantly, we're keen just to stress that we welcome applications from students from lots of different colleges, from different regions across the USA. I've just thrown this slide up to give you a sense of some of those more competitive awards that we have received students through this year. So you can see the list of colleges and institutions that those students have come from. And then finally, I'm just going to throw up here my contact info. If you do have any questions, if you want me to send any slides on or further info, you can reach me and the team at northamerica@qub.ac.uk. And as I said, I'm going to pop a link into the chat now that has all the information about the variety of scholarship programs as well. We would love to see some of your students making applications for Queen's for 2024 and beyond. Any final words from you, Peter?
No. If you're kind of done, I'm still happy to answer any questions. I know we've got your president's coming over next week apparently, so I don't know if anyone wants me to comment on that or anything else. There's lots of I mean, that's another example of like how we're quite unique in that what we've got going on here. But I didn't really speak about Irish America so much there. Hopefully I just give you an overview of the conflict, but any other questions on that or about just more generally about what we teach here? Otherwise, I'm happy to call it a day, Anya.
Perfect. I think Haley's here to help us wrap up as well.
Okay, great, no problem.
Thanks, Anya, and thanks, Peter. That was very fascinating. I mean, I learned a lot. I thought I knew a bit about the history, but definitely, yeah, it was a very informative overview. So thanks for that, and thanks, Anya, for giving the additional information about what it's like to kind of study at Queen's University Belfast. And thanks again for everyone who's come along to today's session. I hope that you found it useful and that you can, once we've got the recording, you can share it with your students as well. We'll be putting it on the website and I'll also circulate it to the NAFA listserv. But it's a great resource. If you do have someone come to you and wants to know a bit more about Queen's, just let them watch the video. Does anyone else have anything to add or any questions before we close things off? All right. Well, thanks again for everyone for coming. And yeah, we'll be in touch soon. And I hope you have a good evening, morning, afternoon, whatever time of day it is on your end.
Thank you, Marshall, also for organising this. Delight to be here.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for having us, folks. And yeah, I'm really glad that I've had so many comments now confirming that Dairy Girls is a big hit over there. That's nice to know because I think it is a great show. So it's really nice to hear that. Thank you. And take care, folks, if we're all done here. It's very nice to speak to you, and hopefully that was of some use to you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, folks.